How do you know which features to build into your no-code app and when? How do you know when to build certain features for certain user types? How do you know when is the right time to build certain components of your app throughout your development, your testing, and your launch phases? How do you know how to go from idea to launch in the right order? That's what we're going to break down in this video. We're going to go through an exercise called the perfect pilot. And I'm actually going to share a spreadsheet, really, an exercise and a template with you to help you go through this with your app. So make sure you stick around for that. But we're going to go through each development phase, really, with your app. And you're going to be able to follow along so you can make sure you're building all the right things for the right people at the right time so you can develop, test, and launch correctly. Now, first, if you're new around here, my name is Kristen, and I'm the co-founder of Coaching No Code Apps, where we help non-technical entrepreneurs build custom apps so they can launch their app-based businesses or grow their existing businesses, all without coding and with no technical background required. Okay, so the problems I see with building the first version of your app, working your way from idea to first launch is, number one, a lot of entrepreneurs build too much too soon. And that can lead to really delayed development timeframes, late launches, poor feedback on the other side, and just not a very smooth launch. The other problem on the flip side is maybe not building enough, not giving your users enough, putting enough in their hands so that they can actually achieve a result with your app. And that, while you're likely going to move a lot more quickly, you're probably also not going to get a lot of very good feedback. And then lastly, it's really easy to build the right things, but at the wrong times. And this can lead to a lot of problems with your launch and getting the right feedback as well. You really want to make sure you're building the right things at the right time so that you can kind of put yourself on an upward trajectory, launch the right components of your app to the right people so you can get the right feedback so you can grow and scale a lot more easily. So let's jump over to the whiteboard here. What we're going to do is break down or break apart your entire app into 4 different stages. And as we go through these, I want you to place the different features you have in mind for your app, or maybe the ones you're currently building. I want you to place those into these different stages to make sure, again, you're building the right things at the right time. So on the far left here, in this column, we're going to place the initial features that should go into your first version app. Now, when you're building your first version app, the way you can kind of decide which features go into that is by focusing on your goal with the launch of your first version. So your goal with the launch of the very first version of your app, your pilot app, is really to validate the solution. Now, to be clear, this assumes that you already have idea validation. Idea validation is a little bit different. It's making sure that the problem you're solving exists, that people need that problem solved, and that people will ideally pay to have that problem solved. So this assumes you have that initial idea validation, and now you're moving into product validation. You're validating the solution, the first version of the solution that you've built. Now, if a feature is not going to serve this purpose for you, in that it validates your solution, and for users, in that it provides them with the base layer of a solution, then you should not build that feature yet, or you shouldn't put a feature in this column. And we're going to go through an example, so we'll keep moving forward from here, but that's the goal of this very first column on the screen. Now, moving to the right one, the next version of your app, the goal is to enable adoption. Okay, now this is different, right? When you're building features that will enable your users to use and adopt your app consistently for the long term, those don't necessarily provide the solution to their problem. They just allow the user to solve their problem consistently, to use the solution to solve the problem consistently. Okay, so this next lane or column of features, and again, we'll go through an example, these just enable adoption. So on the left side, you're validating the solution, the core solution. Make it work, and then make it better, right? Make it work first. That's what you're doing here. Next, you're enabling adoption. Okay, assuming you've made it work, then how can we now make it adoptable so that it can work consistently? Okay, now moving to the right, this one's pretty easy. You're aiming to improve the UX, the user experience. Okay, so if you have made the initial solution work, you have enabled adoption, and therefore you have made it work consistently for users, well, now you can make it work better. You can make it more streamlined, more convenient, more enjoyable to use, potentially, maybe more fun to use. You're improving the user's experience on the app. Now, you don't need to think about that to a certain extent when you're validating your solution. You just have to make sure the solution works. It actually solves the problem, right? Then you move on to the adoption. Then you make it better, right? Make it work consistently, make it work better. Okay, so you can see we're just kind of building, we're like laying different layers of this foundation. We're building our way up from that initial base solution. Now, moving to the right is where we do something a little bit different. We address a higher volume, right? We address a higher volume. Now, this is where I see a lot of people moving too early. A lot of people will take this section and move it way over here. Addressing a higher volume really just means you're adding on features that assume your app is being used on a larger scale. Okay, so to go back from the beginning, make it work consistently, make it work better. Now, make it work better for more people. Again, we're just building our way up. Okay, so it can be easy to let yourself build all of that, or try to build all of that into your app before your very first launch. But if you do that, again, it takes us back to the delayed or the elongated development timeframes, the delayed launches. And then when you're trying to get feedback on all of this, something this big, and your very first round of feedback, no less, it can be hard to pinpoint which feedback is actually valuable. What are you actually trying to improve? It's a lot to take in all at once. Really, what you want to do is get feedback here in order to validate that solution, right? Get feedback here to make sure it's actually being adopted here, to make sure you're actually improving the user experience, and then continuously thereafter. Okay, now you don't have to launch your product here and then hit pause, take your users off, and then work on this and then launch again. Now you launch here, you get the feedback, and then you keep working your way out with your users on board. But these initial users are going to be very early beta users. Okay, so you don't have to have a perfect product here, but you really just want to work out in phases, build the layers, make it work consistently, make it work better for more people. All right, so let's go through a quick example of this using an example app, and then I'm going to take you over to the exercise, the template that you can go ahead and download to put your own app through this process. But if we take a dashboard app, any type of dashboard app, okay, let's say we're building a basic dashboard app for companies to view reports. Okay, well, we're going to break up the features into these columns here so we know what to build and what to test and in which order. So with our dashboard app, let's say one of our very core features that's needed in order to validate the solution is a user dashboard setup, right? A user has to come on board. They have to set up their dashboard so they can actually view their reports. Let's say we have to build an API connection for pulling in reports from an external source, and then we'll put in basic graphs, a very base layer of reporting. So basic graphs here, And then we'll add in one more for, let's say, PDF printing. Okay, so let's say these are the core features we need in place in order to simply validate the solution. We're not validating adoption. We're not validating the user experience. We're not building for a higher volume. We're just looking to build the perfect pilot. What can we validate as a solution and gauge whether we can now build that out, or how we can build that out to be applicable on a larger scale. Okay, so we'll have those as our initial features. And when we jump over to the template that I'm going to share with you, I'll show you how to apply these in the extra layers that you're going to want to dig into within each of these features. So moving into enabling adoption. These are features that can help you allow users to consistently use the app, potentially with less hands-on work on your end. So when you're in this stage right here, you're going to be working pretty closely with your very early beta testers, having conversations with them, potentially meeting with them, potentially bringing them on board the app, maybe even sitting next to them, maybe on a Zoom call. It really depends on the situation based on what's most appropriate for your app, but you're going to be working in a pretty hands-on way with them to get them set up, to get them onboarded, just so you can validate the solution. You don't really want to go beyond that until you can validate the solution. But you can't do that forever. It's not scalable, right? And so now you want to build in things that are going to enable the users to use the solution on their own consistently. So a really easy example of this might be onboarding, a hands-off onboarding. So let's say during this very first testing stage, you are onboarding your first users, right? Because you're just validating the solution. Well, to make it adoptable, then you're going to automate that onboarding so that users can come on and set up, maybe their own profiles. Maybe they can upload their own company data, things like that. So you can be a little bit more hands-off. Let's say we'll add in a new feature for adding a new report, or adding new reports, so they can add multiple reports, and then we can just add our basic delete and update reports. So maybe we start out with that core solution with the report we know the company needs no matter what. Enabling adoption, they're going to need more in order to use the app consistently, so we can let them adjust their reports. Okay, now moving into the next lane, the next column, improving the user's experience. This can be really simple. This is where you can start looking at things like design, usability design, right? General navigation through your app. You obviously want to start out with a base level of that makes the app usable, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the easiest app to use yet until you move further into your launches. So let's say we're going to add the ability to have multiple graph views. So in other words, if we're, if in our initial solution, we're showing one type of graph, we're showing a report using one type of graph, maybe a bar chart. Well, improving the user's experience could involve them being able to switch between views. Maybe they want to see a pie chart instead. Maybe that's just more consumable for them. That's a user experience thing. It's not needed in order to validate the solution. They can use one graph, or one type of report. But if you want to give them a better experience, well, then maybe you'll let them choose which one they prefer, right? That's very much an experience type feature. Okay, now moving into the next column, addressing a higher volume. This assumes that now your app is scaling. Okay, so maybe you have more users on board. If that's not applicable to you, maybe your app is just taking on a higher load, right? You're putting a higher demand on the app, okay? Looking at the example of adding on more users though, well, addressing a higher volume, features like that could mean adding, in this example scenario, a team login. Just offering a team login so that if a company, maybe a manager is using the app, well, maybe the manager wants to offer a team login so that anyone below the manager can come in and see certain views. Maybe the manager has access to more. The rest of the team has access to a little bit less, a consolidated view. Okay, so we're addressing a higher volume here, meaning the app is expanding outwards. Maybe we put in guest access. Maybe the company has a client, and the client, being the guest, can come on without creating an account. Maybe they can just view one certain page, whereas the company itself has full access, right? So again, this is just a sort of an off-the-cuff example, but you can see how we're dividing up these features and how each of these groups of features is specific to the goal of each phase here, your goal of each of these phases, okay? Now, it doesn't stop here. So you have these bulk features, but chances are your app is going to involve lots of other processes too. And in fact, within each of these features, there are probably going to be a lot of sub features and maybe even third tier features. And so while we have a pretty concise list on the screen here, what happens when you start building these out and you realize, okay, well, in the user dashboard setup, I actually need these extra 10 mini features, micro features, sub features. Well, things can expand really, really quickly from there. So you have to have a plan for those too. And this is where we're going to switch out to the perfect pilot template that I'm going to share with you. Okay, so on my screen here, you see this spreadsheet, and you're going to be able to make a copy of this so that you can put your own app through, but I'm going to walk you through so you know exactly how to use it. So first things first, I want you to sit down and just think of all the features that are going to go into your app. All the features you've been thinking about, all the features you've been planning about. I'm talking your full scope app, everything you have in mind right now to date. And you're going to add them into each of these cells here on the sheet. Okay, now I've given room for up to 20. You certainly don't need to fill that up. Okay, so if you don't have that many features in mind, that's a good thing. You don't need to, but I'm giving you the space in case you do need it. Now with this sheet, we're looking at the perfect pilot, meaning the very first version of your app that you're going to be bringing test users onto to validate the solution. That's your pilot app. It's like your minimum viable product. Your pilot is something that you're testing on a smaller scale so you can see if and how it's viable on a larger scale. So we're just looking at that left-hand column if you think back to the whiteboard that we were just on. Okay, so you're going to put all your features into these cells, and then you're going to go down to this next step, which is pilot perspective. And you can see 4 questions here. And what I want you to do is for every single one of the features you have in these cells, you're going to ask these 4 questions. So if you have 20 features listed up here, then you're going to be asking these 4 questions for every single one of those 20 features. All right. Now, what that's going to do is allow you to determine whether the features in your full feature list fall into that left-hand column or not. Okay, so they're either going to fall into the left-hand column where you're validating the solution, or they're going to go into another column. Okay, and you're going to indicate here whether or not the feature here, the feature that you're asking these questions on, does actually fall into that left-hand column. Now, once you have those, remember I mentioned that after you have that full feature list, if you start thinking through what each of those bigger features entails, you're going to start pulling out sub features, third tier features. You might have 10 sub features for each main feature, and you have to know whether those also fall into that very left-hand side, that first column where you're validating the solution, because sometimes a bigger feature might fall into that column, but one of the sub features within that feature actually falls into another column. So you want to pull it out so you're not building too much too soon. And that's what you're going to do down here once you get to this perfect pilot step. You're going to put your feature name in here, the feature that you pulled from here and you did determine is in fact a pilot feature. So that means you've asked every single one of these questions of the feature and you've answered yes for them all. Okay, so you're going to take each of those yes features, or the features you've answered yes for, and you're going to pop them down into here where it says feature name. Now notice there's only room for 4, and that's because your pilot app, the very first version, really shouldn't have any more than that. Okay, so this should be enough space for you to create the perfect pilot scope for your app. So once you pop those main features into here, you're going to start thinking through how that process is actually going to work. So going back to our dashboard example, if you have a feature where a user is setting up their dashboard, well, describe that process, right? If you look at this section, describe the process and the value it provides users, you actually have to think from start to finish what a user has to go through in order to make that feature usable or make that feature work. Now, the value in this feature is pretty clear, right? If we're using our example of a user dashboard setup, well, the user has to come on and have a dashboard in order to start setting up or viewing their graphs, right? And so a description of this would be, well, let's say a first-time user is coming on. That means they have to register for the app. They have to input their information, right? They have to set up probably a user profile, which is going to populate their dashboard. And then they have to be spit out onto the dashboard. And then are they going to have functionality they have access to on the dashboard, for example? So you have to think through the entire process. And each of those steps within the main feature, right, user dashboard setup, well, that's technically a sub feature, okay? And you want to go through and describe in the same way each of those sub features. You want to ask yourself, what's the end goal of the sub process? Because if you can describe the end goal, it kind of goes back to how we broke up each of the development phases we went through on the whiteboard. You think about the goal first, the end goal first, and then you work your way back and decide, okay, well, what is going to help meet just that end goal? Well, it's the same thing. So if you think of your sub features, describe the end goal of the sub process. You have your bigger feature, your bigger process, and all the little ones underneath it. Okay. Now, when you describe the goal of the sub process, then you're going to come back up to your pilot perspective questions. And you're going to ask yourself, for every single one of these sub process goals, does this fit my immediate user or market? Do users need this versus simply wanting it, right? You'll go through these 4 questions again. And that's going to help you do the exact same thing with your sub features. Determine whether or not that sub feature falls within the left-hand lane as well. Because remember, it's totally normal to have all of your features here that you have determined fit within your perfect pilot. It's totally normal to have those fall into the left-hand side, but for sub features, 3rd tier features within those to fall into other columns. Okay, so I want you to go over to this and fill this out for your specific app. You can do that by heading to coachingnocodeapps.com/perfect-pilot. coachingnocodeapps.com/perfect-pilot. And you can download that template, make a copy rather, and fill it in for your own app. And when you do that, you're going to be able to scope out your perfect pilot. Remember, that's something that you want to test on a smaller scale to see if and how it can work on a larger scale. And you have to make sure you validate the smaller scale version, your pilot version, your first version, before you move out to those other versions. Otherwise, you're going to be building too much, too soon, the wrong things at the wrong time, getting the wrong feedback, and just launching way too late. So head to coachingnocodeapps.com/perfect-pilot to grab a copy of this, go through it with your app, make sure you're heading into your development and launches correctly and setting yourself up for the most success possible. All right, thanks so much for watching. I hope you found this helpful, and we'll see you in the next one.